As no doubt you've noticed when we're going through the book of Deuteronomy, obviously there are some sections of text that are rather miscellaneous, if you will. In fact, your heading that people have put into translations might say something like sundry laws. That just basically means miscellaneous. And for perhaps part of that is on us, for not being able to see the theme that is being tied together in a certain section of text. And perhaps part of it is simply because the book of Deuteronomy is not intended to be necessarily here we're talking about this whole subject for an extended period of time. It doesn't work like that. It's just the laws that are being stated. And so because of that, last week with Steve's lesson in the evening and then this morning, we thought of that really all of these, though, throughout all the book of Deuteronomy, are all trying to teach us something about holiness. And as we talk about holiness this morning, I want us to describe what holiness looks like. And what holiness, perhaps some synonyms might be for that, or 5 words for holiness. And so these are going to be, again, some miscellaneous lessons that are being taught here, but all surrounding this idea of who we are to be. Because our God is holy, holy, holy. So we are to be in all of our conduct. Now, for a long time, as I was studying for this lesson, I was stuck on 6 as the number that we were going to go with. And then I was really wanting it to be 7, because that just sounded perfect to me, on a lesson on holiness. And as I was telling Evan that, he told me, hey, just sometimes it just doesn't work. And so because of that, I was like, you know what, this goes in with this one. We're going to go with 5. So 5 words for holiness this morning from Deuteronomy chapters 22 and 23. The first word for holiness that we are going to gather this morning is that holiness is about distinction. Distinction, being different in a way. As we look at verse 5, for instance, it says, "A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on a woman's clothing. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Now that doesn't happen at all today, does it? No, it happens all the time. And in fact, it is something that is being fought rather vigorously today. And when we look at that, we may look at that and we may say, when we see someone wearing, a man wearing a woman's clothing or a woman wearing man's clothing, we may just immediately think, well, that's just weird. And maybe we go as far as to say that's disgusting. But do we think of it in terms of holiness? That they are actually doing something that is against the holy nature of God. I think part of the reason maybe we don't take that step is we don't actually see often the spiritual connection between gender and ourselves. That there is a sense of gender identity that we need to latch onto, and God is pronouncing it here. It's not just about the clothes you wear. It's about the distinctiveness of who you are. So perhaps you watched recently, in the last couple of years, you've watched that Matt Walsh video called "What is a Woman?" Have you heard of that at least? And they're just simply asking the question, what is a woman? And the definition that comes out of that is still lacking as far as this command is concerned. Because the answer that is often given is, what is a woman? Is someone who has is it XY when it's with women and XX? Thank you, Jackson. All right, so XY with women, that their chromosomes are such that that is their distinctive quality. And it narrows it down. Am I backwards on that? Okay, Carrie's saying no, Jackson. You got a little bit of a fight there. I'm going to go with my wife. So in which case you have this distinctiveness that takes place, but we make it down to simply a biological thing. What is the biology? And that is what a woman is. That is what a man is. Andrew, you're the one that's grinning back there. So which one is it? Go ahead and tell me.
X is women.
Thank you. All right. All right. So yes, Jackson. Should have gone with my wife. And so we think of it, we narrow it down to biology. What is a woman? Or maybe here we might look at this command and think of it in terms of, well, it's what does a woman wear, or what does a man wear? And we lack what God is actually trying to teach here. He's not trying to teach you your biology. That's so simple. He's not trying to teach you what clothes that women ought to be drawn to versus men. Your culture teaches you that pretty commonly. What he's trying to teach you here is that there is actually distinctive quality of what it means spiritually to be a woman. What it means spiritually to be a man. That's why your clothes actually matter, is are you reflecting what God has given you on a spiritual level? And that's where the world trails off entirely when it comes to the difference between men and women. Is that there is actually a way that you can be a man, and it has nothing to do with your biology. It has to do with who you are as a person. That being a woman, being feminine as a woman actually means something on a spiritual level. So holiness here is actually what's at risk when you put on the clothes that you wear. Holiness demands, as there was at the beginning, distinction between male and female. You drop down into verse 9. Drop down to verse 9. And it says, "You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, or all the produce of the field which you have sown, and the increase of your vineyard will become defiled." We may look at that and say, well, that is something that is teaching us about how we are to garden. And so I can't put my cucumber seeds in my tomato line. Because if I do, then the produce is not going to be as thorough as if I had just designated tomatoes versus cucumbers. That's not what he's trying to teach here. But it was in order to teach a lesson about holiness. There needs to be distinctions. As far as God is concerned, there are distinctions. And so in which case God says, here's the lines that you need to plant in. Do not cross my lines that I have given to you. In verse 10, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. But again, this is not just about what animals that you choose. And in fact, Paul draws this out in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And he makes this point vividly clear. He says, whenever God was giving that instruction, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but when God was giving that instruction between that you shall not put together an unequal yoke, he was trying to teach you something about who you are to be as a people. That you cannot bring yourself under the same conformity with the world. You cannot let the world drag you into different areas like an ox would drag a donkey along. There must be distinction between us and the world. Not in a monastic kind of way, but in our attitudes and hearts and our actions. We are distinct and different. Don't mix together the ox and the donkey. You shall not wear a material mix of wool and linen together. Well, I'm going to guess that all of us would be disobeying that command if it was just about the command. If you look in the back of your tag, you might see that it says 75% this and 25% that. We've been breaking this law for our entire lives, probably. But of course, we've been released from the law of Moses. But what was he even trying to teach them there? A holy people ought to have distinction. There is distinctiveness to our character. You drop down to in chapter 23. In chapter 23 and in verse 1, it says, "No one who is emasculated or has his male organ cut off shall enter the assembly of the Lord." All right, here we go. But then it says, "No one of illegitimate birth shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord." So even here, it is not trying to talk about just simply the physical aspects, but he's trying to teach a lesson concerning distinctiveness of peoples. That these type of peoples are not to be regarded as the people of God. They are not to enter into the assembly. And here's where we see that in verse 3. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even of the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. And because they hired Balaam against you, against Balaam, the son of Beor, with Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. And then in verse 6, you shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. And again, we may look at that and we may say, but you're supposed to love your enemies. Yes, I get that. But the point he's trying to make with the law of Moses is to teach us even a lesson about that when it comes to people who are disregarding God entirely and want to have nothing to do with him, and their ways are so wicked that they are driving people away from the Lord, showing them the same kind of love that you would show your brethren in Christ is not appropriate. There is a distinctiveness that needs to happen there. But then it says in verse 7, you shall not detest an Edomite, that is the sons of Esau, for he is your brother. You shall not detest an Egyptian, because you are an alien in his land. The sons of the 3rd generation who are born to them may enter the assembly. And we may look at that and say, that sounds a little unfair, because wasn't it the Egyptians that put them into slavery? Yes. However, they welcomed them first. The Egyptians were initially extremely hospitable. And they allowed the people of Israel to come into the land. And for that, God blesses the Egyptians and allows them to enter into the assembly. We are a holy people. And so God gives these laws in order to demonstrate that holiness means distinction. We are separated for a purpose, separated for the will of God. The second word for holiness that we see here in these 2 chapters is purity. As a holy people, we are a pure people. I want us to first start in chapter 22 and in verse 22. It says, if a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. And that gets back to the distinctiveness that we were just talking about. But the purging that takes place there is to remove impurity. So what should they have been? Pure. And so there was a woman who was engaged to a man, and in that time, engagement was just as binding as marriage itself. And to walk outside of that was adultery. And so because of that, if these 2 people are impure, that they, I'll add here because it becomes pertinent later, if they by consent come together, they then are breaking that marriage covenant. And God says you're supposed to be pure. Not only to the covenant, but to your own flesh you are to be pure. And so I'm going to purify my people, and they shall be put to death. It continues on with similar laws here. If there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out of the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. So if this sexual relationship happened within the city, then both of them still were to die. Because it was not a rape situation here. She would have and should have cried out for help, and she didn't. And that demonstrates this is not rape in this case. So they both were to die because of their impurity. In verse 25, but if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, now we're talking about something more vicious. And then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. And it goes on to say that she was in the field. It would have been impossible for people to hear her in this deserted area. And so there is a problem, not with the woman, but the impurity of the man. As a holy people, we are to be pure. In verse 28, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her, and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife, because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. And people look at this and they say, whoa, 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 whoa. So you're saying that the Bible teaches that if a woman is raped, that the punishment for that, if she's not married, is that she has to then live with this man, her rapist, for the rest of her life? That's not what this is teaching. The word seize here is not the same as the word force back in verse 25. So this is a consensual relationship that happens. And in our culture and in our day, we would think, totally fine, no problem, no punishment that is necessary for that. Except, if you call it punishment, that then the man has to pay if there is a child that comes from that. This is a very similar type of law. Except, instead of paying for that child for the rest of that child's life, you have to now provide for that woman who you shamed with her. You have to pay for that woman's entire life. Forever. You are bound to her. You cannot divorce her. Because if you were just to send her off, then she would not be even seen as worthy of marriage in the future, in that day and time. So this was a protection for the woman here, that she would be provided for all of her days. But again, the question we're talking about here is purity. They should have been pure, and therefore he not only has to provide for her, but also pay back the dowry price to her father. Again, in verse 30, a man shall not take his father's wife, so that he will not uncover his father's skirt. I think the idea here is former wife, not while they are married together, but former wife seems to be the idea, and it seems to be that it's talking about marriage specifically, not the sexual relationship itself. But then down in verse 17 of chapter 23, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog, and that was an idiom in that day for a male prostitute, into the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord. Why? Because it is impure, dirty money. And so all of these are trying to teach us that holiness is about purity. Back in chapter 22 and verse 20, here it's the context where a man decided out of nowhere that he does not want to be married to this young bride any longer. And so what he does as a scheming plan is he accuses her of sexual impropriety before they got married. And we're going to talk about that in a moment concerning integrity. But he was lying about this. But then it says in verse 22, if this charge is true, that the girl was not found a virgin, then they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel, by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. Purity is so important that to see anything differently is an act of folly. And that maybe seems too soft of a word for us for what this is really trying to say. This is an act of disgrace in the land of Israel. Purge out sin from among ourselves. Because as a holy people, we are a pure people. Another word for holiness is mercy. Holiness is merciful. In verse 1 of chapter 22, verse 1, It says, "You shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep straying away, and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly bring them back to your countryman. If your countryman is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it home to your house. And it shall remain with you until your countryman looks for it. Then you shall restore it to him." Finders keepers doesn't work here. And so when we even use that terminology, when we were little kids is really when we use that, right? We found a $20 bill and we just immediately said finders keepers, and we didn't think anything of it. That was the rule of the day, right? That's what everyone believed whenever we were, 7, 8, 9 years old. Finders keepers is just the law of the land. Well, it wasn't in this day. Because in this day, it is saying this is your brother's. And just to take something because you happen to find it, that was actually an act of impurity because it was unmerciful. Just to keep something for yourself because you found it is actually an aggressive act against someone else. Because you are in essence stealing it from you before they even get a chance to try and seek it out for themselves. It's unmerciful to do such. And so he makes a law regulating this very thing. He goes on and he talks about some other things. That same thing with the garment. You are not allowed to neglect them, verse 3 says. So in fact, you should do something actively to engage in mercy toward your brother in this regard. And in verse 4, you shall certainly help him to raise them up if their ox has fallen down. See, holiness in mercy is not just about not doing something bad. It's about actually doing something to help. Doing something of kindness whenever your brother or your sister is in need. In verses 6, 7, "If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go. But the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days." And we may look at this and we think, that sure doesn't sound merciful. That I see this nest, and here's these little baby birds, and here's this mama raising these babies, and I take the babies? I mean, I think right now, especially, Presley's got some problems with that idea. And of course, there is the aspect of that there is a secondary aspect here, that if you were to take the mama, then those babies are not going to be able to produce because they're going to die. And so you're not going to get any food later on. There's a secondary aspect of that, but that first one is primary here. If you were just to take the mama, those babies are going to die. How merciful were you at that point? So because we do have that God has allowed us to eat of meat, as we talked about this morning in Noah, there are some laws surrounding that as far as that, yes, you're still to be merciful, even when it comes to these things that I allow you to do as well. In verse 8, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you will not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone falls from it." Okay, I've done some sort of renovation work at times. And admittedly, to think of the idea that I have to get permits, to think of the idea that I have to have this beam that goes at a certain width along this area so that I can make a wider doorway, do I have to go through all of this process? God says yes. Because, let's say, and I'm thinking back to whenever we were in Springfield, that there was this doorway that could barely fit 2 kids through it. And we just needed to widen that thing out. And I was trying to figure out what is necessary in order to make this happen. And of course, you're going to have to put a beam because this was a load-bearing wall. but is it just because the law tells me I have to? It ought to be that I don't want my children to die walking under that if it's not safe. Yeah, some of these laws of holiness, of how you conduct yourself on a daily basis, are concerning whether or not you're being merciful to people, even whenever you don't see them right in front of you. In chapter 23 and in verse 15, you shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst. In the place which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him, you shall not mistreat him. Our culture, whenever they are trying to attack the Bible, conveniently miss these verses here. That they say, God commanded slavery in this day. How menacing and unmerciful of a God that you serve. How dare you? And they just conveniently forget that if a slave were to run away from their master, the law actually told you, you be the one to harbor them. You take care of them. Because we also have to think about why slavery even happened in this day. Slavery happened not generally because you were someone who was, it sometimes happened with outsiders concerning war, but that's only happened rarely. And then you didn't have, because it was actually against the law of Moses, to kidnap people in order to enslave them. So that's not part of it either. So that outlaws entirely what the American South and slavery was all about. But instead what you have is that on the whole, primarily, slavery was about paying back your debts. You were indebted to someone and you couldn't pay it back by yourself. You needed to put yourself under someone else so that they could pay your debts for you. That's what slavery was about. And so why would someone walk away from that whenever this master is going to pay your debts for you? Why would you walk away from that? It must have been because it was really harsh being under that particular master. You don't leave your only lifeline unless you think that you are going to be killed, your family is going to be killed, or it is just an abusive situation. So if they leave and they come to your house, you give them refuge. You protect them as an act of mercy, as an act of holiness. In verse 19, you shall not charge interest to your countrymen. Why? Because you're making their sad situation even more difficult to have to deal with. Don't do these things against your brethren. Holiness is about mercy. Holiness as well is about just straight up decency. We talked about that a little bit this morning. It's about straight up decency. We look at verse 9 of chapter 23 and it says, when you go out as an army against your enemies, you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. And we think the word evil, we automatically think sin. And yes, that is a fair representation most of the time for this. But here's what it means by evil here. It means something that's unclean. You look at the next few verses and it says, if there is among you any man who is unclean because of a nocturnal emission, then he must go outside the camp. He may not re-enter the camp, but it shall be when evening approaches, he shall bathe himself with water, and at sundown he may re-enter the camp. In verse 12, a new statement here, it says, you shall also have a place outside the camp and go out there, and you shall have a spade among your tools, and it shall be when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and shall turn to cover up your excrement. Since the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to defeat your enemies before you, therefore your camp must be holy. And he must not see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. You see, holiness is even being described just simply by decency. Are you doing things that are decent? It's not just the ick factor here. It's about holiness before God. Don't do things that are indecent, because that is a statement against your holiness. And I don't have really much more to say about that point, but I think it is helpful for us to even see that in these simple things that we maybe take for granted, God says you ought to think about holiness here. And so whenever the bubonic plague came, because people were being indecent as far as their excrement was concerned, that was a statement against their holiness in a way. They weren't being right before God. I'll just end it on a jovial note. In one way, my dad would sometimes, whenever we would say things, my dad would just sometimes say, all right, let's clean it up. And that's basically what God is saying here. Holiness demands decency. And finally, holiness is about integrity. Integrity. I want us to start in chapter 22 and in verse 13, which goes back to what I said that, what I referenced earlier, this discussion of that there was a man, that he married a woman, and then he decided that he was not pleased with her any longer. And what he would do is he would come up with a scheme. And that scheme was to say, this woman was not a virgin when I married her. And then what the father and the mother would do is they would come out with the evidence of her virginity. Not sure exactly what that is. It's hard to say exactly what that proof was. But they bring something out, and it was laid before the priests, and they would make a determination about whether or not this evidence was valid or not. And so, once they recognized that this man's word was not true, we call that false witness. That goes back to the Ten Commandments, doesn't it? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Well, because he lied, he was not with any amount of integrity. What he had to do as punishment was because he tried to defame a virgin of Israel. She shall remain his wife. He cannot divorce her all his days. Now he's got to live with her. And that's, of course, maybe a slight way of saying it. He doesn't just have to live with her. He has to provide for her. She cannot be put out on the street. She cannot be sent back to her father's house where only shame would be on her head because people would look at her and say she has been defiled. No, you have to do the hard work of providing for her because that's what you promised to do. You lied about your promise, and God's going to hold you to your word. In verse 18, you shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord. Why? Because that's dirty money. You do not bring sin into your relationship with God. You do not bring your sacrifices in sin and impurity. You must have integrity in your worship. In verse 21, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it shall be sin in you. Excuse me, this is chapter 23. It shall be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You don't have to make these promises of sacrifice that were given here in this day. But if you do, you be careful to perform what goes out of your lips and what you have promised. Holiness demands integrity. In verse 24, you shall not enter your neighbor's vineyard. Then you may eat, when you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied. But you shall not put any in your basket. It says the same thing about the standing grain in the next verse. But you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. Why? Because we call that stealing. Yes, there was allowance that God gave that said, I'll allow you when you go through a field to eat to your heart's content. But no more than that. And some people might think, well, this is a really tall vine. My neighbor's not going to see this. Let me just shove a few more in my pockets. Ever done that at an all-you-can-eat buffet? No one's going to know. No one's going to notice. God notices. And God holds you to integrity. Now I want us to go back to chapter 22 and in verse 12. It seems to be that this is the thrust of this perhaps obscure commandment, where it says, "You shall make for yourself tassels on the four corners of your garment with which you cover yourself." And it doesn't say it here, but in the book of Numbers, in chapter 15, it talks about this same thing. And what God says there is that these tassels at the four corners of your garment was a reminder. Now, do you remember whenever you graduated from either high school or college that you had that tassel that came down over your hat, and every step that you took, it would kind of bounce you in the face? You remember that? Well, that's the exact same thing that this was doing for their clothes as well, except it was hitting their feet every step that they took. You would recognize that, and you would be mindful of that on a regular basis. And the reason for that was because God is saying this is a reminder to you that you have made a covenant with your God. This is a constant reminder that every step you take, I'm with you. Every step and every action that you do, I'm watching. And I demand of you integrity to hold to those steps. May my steps be worship. May my thoughts be praise. May my words bring honor to your name. Every step is a devotion of integrity and holiness to God. Because my holiness must be ever before me. That it is always my consideration that I am to be distinct. I am to be pure. I am to be merciful. I am to be decent. And I am to be wholly God's. Completely His. That's holiness. Is being fully devoted to Him in everything that I do. That even these seemingly random commandments, that I even have to think about God whenever in the Old Testament I use the restroom. God cares about your holiness in every step of the way. He cares about your holiness in every action that you do. He says, "Be holy, for I am holy." What I do, everything that I do, is a reflection of who God is. Even down here to the clothes that I wear is a reflection of who God is. Even in average daily activity, do I reflect my holy, holy, holy God? If we don't, then we need to repent. We need to be made right with God, to bring ourselves under conformity to holiness. And that means every command He gives, I must do. If you haven't done that and you're ready to recommit yourself to God, to pay your vows as you promised, because all of us made a promise to God. Whenever we were buried in baptism for the forgiveness of our sins, we made a promise to God that I am dead to myself and only alive in you. Your steps are my steps now. I am alive in Christ. If there is anyone who's ready to make that commitment today, we plead with you, come to the front while we stand and sing.